Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. In its 8th missile test of the year, North Korea claimed it fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile. If it was an SLBM, as they say, it would be its first SLBM test in 2 years. And now, U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Slbm, is in Seoul. He said earlier he will continue discussions of South Korea's end-of-war proposal and other issues of mutual concern during his visit to Seoul. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Bruce Bennett. Dr. Bennett is an international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation. He has worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense and with the U.S. Pacific Command and Central Command. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S. Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both.
Thank you, Young-Gyo.
I'll start with Mr. Snyder. North Korea is not showing any sign that it'll stop testing its missiles. The latest one was its 8th missile test this year. What was your first thought?
Well, my first thought was that North Korea appears to be back to normal in terms of its testing cycle after a break as a result of the COVID pandemic. So I think that we can presume that the situation inside North Korea, at least as related to missile development objectives, has returned to normal. And then my second thought was really that North Korea continues to check off the list of desired capabilities that it revealed last January at the 8th Workers' Party Congress, and SLBM capability was one of those.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bennett, North Korea claims the latest missile it test fired was an SLBM. How likely is it that the missile could be really an SLBM?
Well, when you say an SLBM, it's a missile that can be launched from a submarine. It probably was that. The question was, though, was it launched from a submarine? That we don't know. If really, as Japan said, 2 missiles were launched, only one of them could have been launched from a submarine because the submarine that launches those missiles has only one tube. So we don't know whether the missile that worked was launched from a submarine or from an underwater platform. We just don't know at this stage.
Right. Dr. Bennett, if we assume one of them was launched from submarine, how advanced do you think they are? Are North Koreans able to launch this kind of missile from submarines?
Well, I think we have to remember that even with South Korea, the missile that South Korea launched from its submarine was a variant of its land-based missile, its Hyunmoo 2B. So they took the land-based missile and adapted it. This is starting to look like North Korea took its KN-23, its missile like the Russian Iskander, and adopted it for a submarine launch. We don't know for sure, but that's what it's looking like. That would not be at all illogical or potentially all that difficult to do once you've managed the process of learning how to eject a missile from a submarine and get it to light off and actually work. Is this really an advanced missile? Well, the Iskander's fairly advanced for in-theater types of actions. And certainly from a South Korean perspective, this is a troublesome missile. We have to remember, North Korea is trying to condition South Korea and the U.S. They're trying to get us used to these short-range missile tests, even though they're prohibited by the UN Security Council resolutions. They're trying to continue the Trump heritage of saying, oh, short-range missiles are no big deal. And that undercuts the U.S. reassurance of our ally. It's not a good thing for the U.S. to say, oh, it's okay if you fire missiles that could hurt South Korea.
Right. Mr. Snyder, what do you think the latest test tells about where North Korea stands in terms of its missile technology?
I think that this is an area that North Korea is trying to develop, and it's going to require more tests before North Korea is going to be able to move to deployment. The other issue that some have pointed to is that we're not really sure what type of submarine North Korea intends to launch a missile from. And so, that is another big question, I think, related to North Korea's development of this capability.
Mr. Snyder, the U.S. said the latest missile is violating the UN Security Council resolutions. What is the reason that the U.S. should be wary about this latest missile launch?
Well, Bruce already outlined that as well. And so what I would say is that the UN Security Council resolutions are the primary enforcement mechanism as related to North Korea's illegal nuclear and missile development. And what North Korea is trying to do is to legitimize itself as a responsible nuclear state, as one that has these capabilities. And I think that we can see that very clearly in, for instance, the North Korean statements that it's made in defense of its program at the UN General Assembly. But the fact remains that the Security Council has passed numerous resolutions condemning these developments. And because it's the primary vehicle for enforcement, the U.S. And the international community needs to hold to the resolutions as a symbol of the fact that North Korea is in violation.
All right. Dr. Bennett, are you worried that North Korea seems to be diversifying its missile capabilities?
Sure. I mean, this kind of development, and especially their modernization, their ability to replace their old Scud missiles, which were very inaccurate, with the much more accurate and maneuverable KN-23 that will give missile defenses a problem. These are all developments which are not a good kind of development from a U.S. ROC perspective. And, following up on what Scott said, I think we need to be very clear. North Korea keeps saying, well, you've got a double standard. South Korea is developing a 1,500-kilometer range cruise missile, so are we. They launching an 800-kilometer range ballistic missile, so are we. So it's a double standard. The problem is North Korea's missiles are being developed for nuclear weapon delivery. And that is a major reason why the sanctions have been implemented. That is not a double standard. And that is the case where we need to take action against North Korea to demonstrate that the problem is its ability to deliver nuclear weapons. They need to be thinking about denuclearizing. As well, South Korea needs to be cautious about anything associated with nuclear weapons, as has developed in the debates over the presidential election.
All right. Dr. Bennett, North Korea's foreign ministry released a statement saying its test firing of a new Slbm was not targeted toward the United States, adding that there is no need for Washington to worry or agonize. What is the meaning of this? Are they laying the groundwork for the future talks?
I think they're trying to implement their strategy of breaking the U.S. ROC alliance. How can they launch missiles that threaten South Korea when the U.S. has guaranteed South Korea that we have South Korea's back? We're going to take care of these kinds of situations. That's our extended deterrent, our nuclear umbrella guarantee. How can we ignore the fact that they're launching missiles that could hurt our ally? We have committed to the security of our ally. Even the Biden administration, with their interim national security strategy, very clear that anything that threatens South Korea is considered by the U.S. to be a serious threat. So the North Korean statement's nonsense. That does worry the U.S. because it threatens our ally.
All right. Mr. Snyder, some people in South Korea say a series of North Korea's missile tests can be interpreted as the regime's willingness to talk, since it shows it is building up leverage for the talks. Do you agree with that view, or should we see this as ironic?
Well, I think the problem with that view is that you simply don't make that level and scope of investment into developing a capability simply in order to give it away. And so I think that instead, what North Korea's strategy is to create the circumstances by continuing to really control facts on the ground, whereby we find ourselves accepting the outcome that North Korea seeks, which is legitimacy as a nuclear state. And so what they're really looking towards is diplomacy is not something that North Korea is necessarily trying to avoid, but they want diplomacy on their terms, namely diplomacy focused on recognition rather than diplomacy focused on denuclearization.
All right. North Korea's latest missile tests came as South Korean officials continue to pitch the possibility of the end of the war declaration. South Korea's chief nuclear envoy, No Kyu-dok, visited Washington just right after Seo-hun, the South Korea's top national security advisor, visited Washington. Mr. Snyder, what did you think about this array of visits?
Well, we certainly do see a flurry of high-level consultations, not only on the diplomatic side, but also on the intelligence side. I think that what is really hard to tell, and of course we know that the Moon administration is prioritizing reinvigoration of diplomacy. And so what's really hard to tell is whether the intensification of consultations is a result of a gap between the U.S. and South Korea that needs to be closely coordinated, or whether it is about the development of a more detailed diplomatic plan for engagement with North Korea. And really the key to that question lies with the North Koreans themselves, and the question of whether there are any indications that North Korea is willing to actually engage diplomatically on terms or by sending signals that North Korea is willing to do something that might justify a return to the negotiation process.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bennett, did you find it unusual that South Korean officials visited Washington in two separate trips within just a few days?
Kim Jong-un understands South Korean policy and politics. They understand that President Moon is very anxious to establish a legacy of peaceful coexistence, his hallmark program from the beginning of his administration. They've withheld the ability to do that and withheld it. And now in the last few months of his presidency, they're dangling that possibility with diplomacy. I think we have to remember what North Korea has done with previous diplomacy. Look at the Panmunjom Agreement. How many of those provisions has North Korea really followed? Has it continued negotiating with the South on a regular basis? Has it provided for visits between North and South Korea as promised and committed to in the Basic Agreement of 1991? Has it fully implemented all previous agreements and declarations like the 1992 Denuclearization Declaration? The answer is no, North Korea has not. So negotiations with North Korea are not a solution. They lead to some kind of agreement, but North Korea wants that exactly as Scott said, on their terms to accomplish their objectives. And when it's not one of their objectives, they're quite prepared to violate the agreement in whatever way they choose to.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bennett, the South Korean officials said the understanding on the U.S. side about the necessity of declaring the end of war has deepened. Does this mean the U.S. is closer to agreeing to declare the end of the Korean War?
We don't really know. The Biden administration hasn't said. It would appear to me that our understanding is deepened in the sense of how anxious the Moon administration is to get an agreement. It's not clear that the U.S. is seeing that this is a meaningful thing. Let's remember, if we're going to have a peace declaration, it should be a two-sided declaration. Is North Korea really going to end its hostility towards the United States? Because that's what peace means, is they end theirs. Are they going to stop indoctrinating their people? Are they going to stop doing missile launches? Are they going to stop doing nuclear development and production of nuclear weapons? Because those would be all good signs of peace, but those are not things that North Korea is putting on the table. If those don't happen and we do some kind of declaration, will there really be peace? And I think the answer is no, not really. It's going to be on North Korean terms that they get what they want. And that, I think, if the U.S. understanding is deepening in that regard, that doesn't mean we're closer to an agreement.
All right. Mr. Snyder, what's your thought on this? Is the U.S. moving toward the end of the war declaration?
Well, Bruce keeps on pointing to North Korea's credibility problem, and I think that it is pretty severe. And what we really need to see is greater efforts to draw out from North Korea an understanding of the mutuality and reciprocity that would be needed in order to forge a viable pathway. And yet, the Moon administration has really been focusing more on Washington, it appears. I think the reason for that is that South Korean public opinion has developed in such a way that the Moon administration actually needs a stamp of approval in the form of alliance buy-in in order for its own efforts toward North Korea to be credible. But what we really need to see more than anything else is evidence that North Korea is willing to take a step forward and offer something important. Maybe it could be even further pledges of self-restraint or enhanced willingness to curb its own testing or even a return to other forms of discussions about stabilization on the peninsula in order for this really to be viable. And we haven't seen that yet. It doesn't mean that something might not be going on under the surface, but I'm actually doubtful.
Mr. Snyder, amid all this, Sung Kim is now visiting South Korea. He just had a meeting here in D.C. with South Korean officials. Why did he have to go to Seoul himself? Is the current circumstance demand such frequent meetings?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. I think that it's very clear that the Moon administration is in a phase where it really wants to engage. I've pointed to the missing element that we don't know, and that is what's actually happening underground in terms of any possible interactions with North Korea. If there is nothing, then this is simply an exercise in alliance management. If there is something going on, then it's really critical for the U.S. and South Korea to be on the same page as we move to a phase where there might be an opportunity for diplomatic engagement.
All right. Dr. Bennett, your thought on this? Is something happening, and is that why Sung Kim had to go to Seoul?
Well, the whole issue of some kind of peace declaration is very, very important to President Moon. It may well be that Sung Kim needed to go to Seoul to talk to President Moon and to be able to explain to him the U.S. position and what it is that the U.S. needs in order for a meaningful agreement. The U.S. is going to want an agreement like Scott described, where there is reciprocity, there is something that makes it useful and important to both sides. And so far, I haven't heard anything official on what North Korea is prepared to do in terms of making peace a reality. And that may well be what Sung Kim's trying to explain to the ROK government is, we need something from the North. Recently, the State Department has said, you know, we're tired of negotiating with ourselves. If the North Koreans keep saying we've got to end our hostility, well, be specific. Tell us what you want us to do and tell us what you're prepared to do. Let's not go to generalities and require us to come up with an answer.
Dr. Bennett, my last question for today. North Korea's missile tests are not stopping, and South Korea is pushing for declaring the end of the Korean War. can these two go together? And how can the end of the war declared when the missile tests are still there?
Well, it all depends upon how desperate the U.S. and the ROC are for negotiations. If we're really desperate, sure, we could decide to do that. But the reality is peace suggests that we shouldn't do that. That if North Korea isn't prepared to avoid missile tests, then there's not a lot of reason. We have to go back and remember in March of 2018, when the South Korean officials visited with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, and he asked for a summit meeting with President Trump for them to help make it happen, he committed at that time to no tests, not long-range tests only, but no missile tests or nuclear tests at all, as long as interactions were going on. He's violated that commitment many, many times. And I think we have to say, if you're really serious about wanting peace, stop violating your commitment.
Mr. Snyder, do North Korea's missile tests complicate South Korea's efforts to formally end the war?
Well, yeah, I think they do, because I think that our conversation so far has really pointed to the possibility that we're seeing a peninsular missile race, some kind of space race, and this is not a propitious moment for declarations. Instead, I think that what it points to is possibly the need for a redoubled arms control approach, including a focus on practical interactions and negotiations between North and South Korea over how to reduce tension rather than making declarations.
As the United States says, it remains open to dialogue with North Korea. Diplomats from both the U.S. and South Korea are moving briskly. Whether this will be surely directed toward the discussion of North Korea's denuclearization, we'll have to keep watching and find out. Dr. Bennett and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.